All right, welcome to the webinar, Using Parent and Youth Feedback to Inform High-Quality Educational Programming for Students with Disabilities. Now, this webinar is sponsored by the Progress Center, which is a U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education funded center focused on promoting progress for students with disabilities. My name is Tessie Bailey, and I'm the director of the center. Now, the center was developed in response to the Andrew F. Supreme Court decision, which was in 2017, and it stated that the IEP, or the Individualized Educational Program, offered by a local education agency, often referred to as a district, must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Now, under IDEA, we know that the IEP serves as the foundation for promoting progress for students with disabilities. And over the last year, or past 2 years, we've released a number of tip sheets and online modules and webinars to support educators in the development of individualized programming. Now, today's session will focus on our group findings from some focus groups that we did with parents, caregivers, and students who are young adults with IEPs. Now, to ensure free, appropriate public education, you can see that in the last box where it says FAPE, as well as improved outcomes for eligible students with disabilities. The Progress Center supports local educators in both the development and implementation of high-quality educational programming. And I'll just state that when we think about educational programming for students with disabilities, it's not just the IEP, but also the supplemental Tier 1 and supports that are being provided to the student. Now, the Progress Center provides information and resources, tools, and technical assistance to support educators in both the development and implementation. We have 3 aligned streams of work: knowledge development, intensive technical assistance, and universal supports. So today, our knowledge development work will be highlighted, and we'll conclude this session with valuable resources to support local districts and schools in developing the knowledge, the skills, and the infrastructure to promote progress for students with disabilities. Now, we want to start out with a poll, and so you'll see it pop up on your screen. So please take a moment to respond to the question around what is your current role? Are you a special educator, general educator, administrator, or other? And if you are other, if you can just type that in the chat box so we have a sense about who is visiting with us today. So we're about 53%, we're getting closer. And I see special education mediation programs. All right, we're pretty much, I see TA providers. Great, so we're about 90%, so we will close today's session. And what you'll, or not the session, but the poll, and what you'll see is most of you fall out of either not being a special ed teacher, general educator, or administrator. So we have a lot of others. So just make sure you share in the chat box who's with us today. I want to welcome our special educators and administrators for joining us today. All right, I see some parents as well. That's excellent. All right, well, I am pleased to introduce our presenters for today. I'll first introduce Dr. Stacy Hirt, and she supports the knowledge development work of the Progress Center, and she is joined by Joey Hunziker, who is the director of the Young Adult Initiatives with the National Center on Learning Disabilities, often referred to as NCLD. And I just want to thank NCLD. They've been a partner of the center since its launch in 2019. All right, Stacy, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, again, yes, I'm Stacy Hirt. I'm a researcher with the American Institutes for Research. So our objectives today are: 1, to first share survey findings from a series of focus groups with families who had children with individualized education programs during their school years, and also focus groups with young adults who had IEPs in school. 2nd, understand families' perspectives and experiences. 3rd, identify specific examples provided by families of students with disabilities and young adults with disabilities So we're going to share lots of examples and discuss some collaboration successes, but also challenges. And last, we will share practice recommendations and resources based on survey findings. So why conduct student and family focus groups? Well, in 2021, we partnered with NCLD, the National Center of Learning Disabilities, and SPAN, a parent advocacy network. And together our goal was to hear perspectives from families and students about developing and implementing their IEPs, the extent to which having an IEP contributed to high school success and post-high school success, and last, to what extent the quality of services supported educational goals. Our next goal was to share learning with schools to support the development and implementation of high-quality educational programming. Which brings us to this brief, Perspectives and Experiences with Special Education. So this brief is the anchor of our webinar presentation today. It highlights the focus group questions, the survey findings, quotes, practice recommendations, and additional resources. So we will be dropping that in the chat so you can get more information on the resources and links that anchor this webinar. So before I get started with parent perspectives, I want to share the structure of this webinar. This webinar is structured into three main parts. So first, I'm going to share the parent survey findings. Next, Joey will share the young adult survey findings. And last, together, we will share 8 practice recommendations and various resources for educational stakeholders supporting students with disabilities. So let's get started. So parent recruitment began about a year ago, actually a year ago this month. So this visual captures the 4 virtual focus groups that were held last spring. The next slide highlights a snapshot of participants. So as you can see on the far left column, you can see that we surveyed a total of 35 parents. And the most interesting recruitment demographic that's actually not on this slide is that 35 of the 35 respondents surveyed identified as female. So in the next middle column, it highlights the 10 disability categories. Can you go back one slide? It highlights the 10 disability categories. The only areas that were not represented were deafness, deafblindness, and orthopedic impairment. In the third column to the right, it highlights the parent representation from 16 states. So this is our first parent survey question of 7 questions. So for each statement, parents were asked, do you strongly agree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree with the following statement? So for this question, parents were asked, my child has been successful in school. So as we go through the survey responses, notice the chart split, as in to the far left, the blue notes strongly disagree, and to the far right, the purple represents strongly agree. So I'm just going to share highlights from the survey, but just so you get a gauge of the blue is strongly disagree, and the purple is strongly agree. So each parent was then given an opportunity to give a rationale for their response. So for question number 1, findings indicated that less than half of parents and caregivers surveyed thought their child had been successful in school. Some parents define success as their child making academic progress towards goals, and other parents define success as the school and education system at large, recognizing the strength of their child while holding high expectations. So this next slide represents a quote from one of our parents. So special education isn't meant to be a lifelong sentence. It is support services to build and improve skill deficits. Students should exit special education. Special education is too focused on being compliant for procedures versus providing faith. So question number 2, the statement, again, parents responded, agree or disagree. Overall, I found the academic, behavioral, and social emotional supports my child received help facilitate their success in school. Again, answers reflect how parents define success. So similar to question number 1, less than half of parents and caregivers found the academic, behavioral, and social emotional supports their child received facilitated school success. Further, some parents noted the support their child received did not match the child's disability and or academic needs. Many of the accommodations were provided based on what was available and not what was developmentally appropriate. So one parent noted here, I would agree that school does not understand his disability and does not have appropriate methodologies to meet his needs. For question 3, my child feels or felt included in his or her school. For example, my child was invited to participate in school activities like sports, extracurricular activities, and back to school nights. For this question, survey responses indicated the majority, 78% of parents and caregivers reported their child felt included in their education. This is great, this is amazing, but we still have 1 in 5 parents who did not agree, and they shared their child felt they were not included in their education. One parent shared, I would say, if they're in a sport or activity based, he feels included. If it requires any academic knowledge, he would shy away and choose not to participate. For question 4, the statements, as a parent or caregiver of a child with a disability, I feel or felt included in the school environment. For example, I was invited to fully participate in school activities like back to school nights, parent-teacher association events, et cetera, et cetera. So while some noted mixed experiences, the majority, 63% of parents and caregivers felt included in the school community. One parent responded, I have felt my schools did a good job with parent engagement. I led our special ed parent advisory committee for years, served a term on the school board, and participated on various stakeholder committees. These were roles focused on input and decision-making. The school also did a good job in providing more social activities. Question number 5, the statement was, I was meaningfully involved in the development of my child's IEP. For example, I feel or felt free to ask questions and or offer suggestions as the IEP team discussed the goals, strengths, supports, and need for my child. Survey responses indicated here that the majority, 63% of parents and caregivers felt meaningfully involved in the development of their child's IEP, describing opportunities to ask questions and offer suggestions as the IEP team discussed goals, supports, and student needs. One parent noted, I received test scores twice per year as per the testing requirements, each quarter for the IEP report card, and then monthly with attached data charts to support info in the written narrative. Question 6, I regularly receive data about how my child was progressing towards his or her IEP goal. For this question, less than 34% of respondents shared they regularly receive data about their child's progress. So let me repeat, less than 34%. Many of the responses from the parents who disagreed with the statement focused on the lack of useful information and data they received and what it communicated about their child and their goals. So some parents found that the progress reports they received improved after they pushed for some more communication. One parent noted progress monitoring was lacking and it was often anecdotal or observational. The question 7, the last of the parent focus group questions states, this question is for parents and caregivers whose child finished high school. It stated, my child has high quality post-high school transition plan. So again, a lot of our parents that were surveyed, some still had students in school. So the parents that responded to this question had students that had experienced post-transition and post-high school. For this question, survey results indicated less than 29% of parents and caregivers thought their child received a high-quality transition plan. One parent noted, it doesn't seem like the success of students with disabilities is a priority. Parents here in my district are often pressured to designate a non-diploma track transition plan for students with IEPs. Transition plans look totally different than typical learners. So at this time, I'm going to pass the conversation to Joey, and he's going to share focus group survey results for young adults.
Thanks, Stacy, and thanks for going over that. Hi, everyone. My name is Joey Hunziker with the National Center for Learning Disabilities. I've had the great pleasure of working with AIR and the Progress Center for almost 3 years now on this project. So we're really excited to be able to share these results with you. I'll be going through our survey and focus group results that we conducted with young adults. If you could go to the next slide. Our recruitment was a little complicated for young adults. As some of you may know, finding and reaching young adults takes a lot of effort, in fact. So we did national outreach, we had a social media campaign, and we did some targeted recruitment through some of our existing networks. All of that was to get young adults to complete a screening survey to make sure that we had a representative sample of young adults. And then we held several focus groups. If you see, there were 8 focus groups. They tended to be smaller than the parent focus groups. And we also did 2 individual interviews with young adults who requested an individual conversation as opposed to a large group. Next slide, please. We had fewer young adults represented than parents. As you see, there's 21. Diversity of the respondents, we had 67 of those who identified as white, 14 who were identified as Black or African American, and then a good mix of folks who identified as multiracial, and then 5% as Hispanic or Latino. We had 10 disability categories represented, although the overwhelming majority of students did show up with a specific learning disability. It is the highest incident disability in K-12 system, so that makes sense. And we had 16 states represented in our focus groups. Next slide. Yes, so I'm gonna share that there were 6 questions for the young adults. And I want to share just before I jump in here, a lot of the young adults had fairly positive responses to most of the questions. It was in the discussion post survey that we probed a little bit deeper, and some of their responses were a little more mixed, and they opened up and revealed a little bit more about their experiences in school and with the educational programming that they received. So hopefully you can pick up on some of the nuance here as I go through these. So the first question was, I feel like my teachers, principals, and other staff have or had high expectations for me. As you see, we had some young adults who disagreed, about 35%, but the overwhelming majority either agreed or strongly agreed. We did focus groups with mostly young adults who had already graduated high school, but a few who were still in high school. So that, I think that breakdown is important to understand. Many of these young adults had already graduated, and so their sphere of reference was a little bit in the past. Some young adults also noted a mixed response of high and low expectations. Next slide. I would say, this is a quote from one of our young adults, I would say that teachers and our school had frustratingly high and low expectations of me in different contexts. Thank you, next slide. The second question was, I feel or felt like my teachers helped me to reach my goals. There's a very strong positive response there. About 81% indicated that their teachers helped them to reach their educational goals. However, some of them indicated that they felt like their teachers weren't really bought into helping them with their specific goals or to understanding what they needed as individual students to be successful. And that's a recurring theme that I hope you'll pick up on some of these responses as well. Next slide. So one of the quotes we heard from young adults was, my goals were written in my IEP, but I think they could have actually taken more interest in what my goals were. And I think that's an important nuance as you think about, there's IEPs and then there's a transition IEP for students who are leaving the high school setting. And that goal setting can and should look a little bit differently. And some young adults noted that they really wanted that to be a little more individualized. Next slide, please. The third question was, I was involved in developing my IEP, or individualized education program. While many young adults did agree with this, they thought their input was considered when developing their IEPs. Next slide. A quotation from a young adult: the school team always talks to the parents, not to us. Ask me to, ask the students. We heard that quite a lot from young adults, that they felt like while they were included in the process, those meetings, the discussions, whether or not they were actually elevated and involved in the decision-making was a very different example. And that's something that we heard from quite a few of our young adults. Our fourth question that we asked was, I think having an IEP and the supports provided through my IEP were important for my success in school. As you can see, overwhelmingly young adults valued having an IEP and the supports and accommodations that came through having an IEP. This was really important for them because navigating school without accommodations is a very, very difficult process for many students. As you'll see here in this quote, extra time was really the most important for me. I always used all of my extra time, and distraction reduced an environment and a distraction reduced environment to test in. Not having to use a Scantron was helpful, as well as being allowed to walk out and take a break when I needed to. The next slide. Question 5 was, I feel or felt like I was included in my special education classroom and general education classrooms. You'll see that they felt that they were included in their classrooms. The discussion here also centered on not just the academic setting of a school, but the non-academic settings, and whether or not students with disabilities felt included in those as well. If you'll go to the next slide. This is from a young adult. There was a special ed teacher in addition to the main teacher in the general classroom who gave me extra support while not making me feel completely separated from my friends and classmates. And then in the last, oh, that was our last question, sorry. I miscounted. So yeah, I thank you all for listening. I'll pass this back to Stacy and we'll start talking about some of the recommendations.
Perfect. Thank you, Joey. So that's a lot. We shared a lot. We had hundreds of pages of quantitative and qualitative data from our parent and adult youth focus groups. So together, SPAN, NCLD, and the Progress Center collapsed the survey responses. We then coded, we conducted a data analysis, and identified 8 practice recommendations for educational stakeholders. So I'm going to share the first 4 practice recommendations, and then Joey will share practice recommendations 5 through 8. So practice recommendation number 1, this sounds like common sense, but you would be surprised. Involve families and students in the IEP process. So parents, caregivers, and young adults want to be more involved in the development and implementation of students' IEPs. Parents, caregivers, and young adults value their roles in the IEP process. Districts should ensure meaningful participation of roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders on an IEP team. So we've highlighted some resources for you, beginning with resources to support involving students and families. So the first is the Progress Center self-paced learning module, the IEP team. And I want to note quickly, again, this is all anchored from the brief, so you do not have to write down all the websites. All the websites are linked for you in the executive summary brief. So the first on the left is the Progress Center self-paced learning module, the IEP team, who's who, and other considerations. The second is Wisconsin Family Assistance Center for Education, Training and Support User Guide. The third is the Early Childhood Advisory Council, Student-Led IEPs webinar. Thanks, Amy. So again, Amy just dropped that link so you can access all the links. Recommendation number 2, intervene early. Parents, caregivers, and young adults noted that early evaluation and early intervention were a key aspect of student success. Young adults noted that early disability identification and intervention were critical components. So we've identified 2 resources to support intervening early. The first is the National Center on Intensive Intervention website. The second is the Progress Center Reviewing and Intensifying Instruction Practice Brief. The third recommendation, communicate and collaborate often. Again, this sounds like common sense, but you can't do this enough. Parents, caregivers, and young adults want to actively collaborate in the development and implementation of students' educational programming. Schools and districts should support IEP teams, parents and caregivers, and students with disabilities by communicating often to share information about student progress and promote opportunities for engagement, problem solving, collaboration, and advocacy. School staff should proactively seek input from parents and students to help ensure they are valued, co-equal members of the IEP team. So as Joey mentioned, we had one student that was quoted to saying they wish they were a part of those meetings. One shared, "I felt like I was on the outside looking in." Further, she stated, "They were discussing my needs and accommodations. Why didn't they just ask me?" She said she had many accommodations in her IEP that were not needed. So communicate and collaborate often. These practice resources to support communication are first, the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution and Special Education, otherwise known as CADRE, Inclusive Listening, Building Understanding, Supporting Understanding webinar. The second is the CADRE User Guide that highlights engaging parents in productive partnerships. And the third is the National Dissemination Center for Children with Disabilities, Steps to Success, Communicating with Your Child's School User Guide. The fourth recommendation is build on strengths. Young adults value customized and individualized educational programming and accommodations that were tailored to their needs. So build on their strengths. Districts should set ambitious expectations for students across general and special education settings. So the majority of our students share they valued high expectations. Students repeated focus group after focus group. They wanted the bar to be raised. 2 resources supporting building on strengths are the Progress Center IEP Tip Sheet series. These IEP tip sheets include, but not limited to, class, measurable annual goals, measuring progress towards goals, overview of statement and services, and many, many more. The links are all in the brief. The second resource is the TIES Center, Planning for Instruction, both at school and distance learning, the 5C Process User Guide. The TIES Center is the National Technical Assistance Center on Inclusive Practices and Policies. It works with states, districts, and schools to support the movement of students with disabilities from less inclusive to a more inclusive environment. Now, Joey's going to share practice recommendations 5 through 8.
Thanks, Stacy. So as Stacy shared the first 4, we have a couple of more recommendations. So one thing that we heard quite often from young adults was that they really wanted their accommodations to match what they needed and not just a menu of options that have been afforded to other students. So districts should really support the development and implementation of high quality educational programming by revisiting what accommodations and modification supports that they have and are providing to students to make sure that they're matching what students need. And some of the resources shared here, you'll see the National Center for Systemic Implementation has a couple of video series there focused on strategies. And then as Stacy mentioned previously, the IEP tip sheet series, there are a couple of good one-pagers there that are offered as resources. And recommendation number 6 is for districts to provide inclusive opportunities. thinking about the individualized needs of students and what is considered appropriate to create an inclusive educational programming for students with disabilities, and make sure to include students with disabilities in both academic and non-academic activities. As I mentioned before, that's something that we heard, that students felt like they were included in the classroom, but out of the school, there was a less strong sense of belonging and inclusion in the wider school community. And some resources here. You'll see a resource from CCSSO, the Cedar Center, and the Oak Foundation around building and supporting inclusive schools. Then you'll see a resource from the Progress Center focused on practice and 10 ways that schools can foster belonging for students with disabilities. And then the last resource is from the TIES Center, and that focuses on instructional practices for students with the most significant disabilities. Then recommendation number 7, that transition period for students is very important. And so districts should focus on building young adult capacity in the areas of self-advocacy, self-determination, understanding their rights under disability laws, and providing accommodations for that high school and post-high school transition to ensure that they're successful. And those are things that can be done in the classroom and outside of the classroom to support students, as well as in that transition plan. Some of the resources that you'll see, a resource from NTACT, the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. They have a collaborative focused on this. And then a couple more resources around that secondary transition process and what that looks like for students. There are both legal requirements of that transition process, but also good practices and things that can really build students' confidence and self-advocacy skills so that they can successfully transition after high school. And then in our last recommendation, professional learning. As I'm sure everyone who is a teacher or in a school-based setting, professional learning is really critical to building that relationship between parents, caregivers, students, and the school community. As you heard, parents, caregivers, and young adults really want teachers and support staff to have knowledge about disability, to understand evidence-based practice and what professional development practices support that, and a general understanding of special education law. It's not required that you be an expert on IDEA or the ADA, but understanding like what does that process look like for students, who should be involved, what are the roles of everyone involved in the process of creating an IEP and developing inclusive programming. That's really something that we heard. And the last set of resources actually come from the Department of Education. There are some Dear Colleague letters and other resources on IDEA to be able to support you with that. And I think actually is the one on the left, Stacy, is that the Progress Center as well? Am I wrong? It is. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to make sure. I was like, it looked familiar. I thought it was the Progress Center. But yeah, and those are all of our recommendations for today. I think we're moving into questions.
Yeah, so we'll move into questions, and I want to encourage attendees that if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear it. You can use the chat box that's down at the bottom. You'll also see the Q&A, and will just come to me, and I can ask those questions to our panel. And I just want to say, Joey, one of the things that you mentioned in your section that I just want to reiterate is that this idea of belonging and inclusion, and I was just looking at how the parents didn't really indicate that they felt that their kids had as much opportunities for belonging, but it kind of looked like the students had indicated that they felt like they were more included. And so I don't know if you can just share a little bit about just some of the things that you all got around this idea of belonging and inclusion for students.
Yeah, I would say generally the young adult and student responses were a bit more positive, focusing on their experiences in school. They definitely had suggestions of what could be improved, and they commented quite a lot on, they felt that teachers and schools were there to support them, but was it individualized? Was it really focusing on their needs and what they wanted after high school? Something we heard from some of the young adults was that they felt included in the classroom, and that was great, but what about the wider school community? And that was a little hard to parse out because we didn't ask specifically about some of those details, but many of them felt comfortable, I think, going a little bit deeper into that. And if folks read the paper, you'll see a little bit more of that nuance that we didn't necessarily cover here.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's been emerging. I know the Progress Center, you mentioned those resources, and the TIES Center is really promoting belonging, which does go beyond the inclusion within instructional supports within a classroom, that kids feel part of that community. And I think COVID has really highlighted that for us. So thanks for sharing that. And Stacy, I don't know if you want to add any to that, because I know you shared the parents' perspective around their kids being included and feeling like they belong just wasn't really the same. So it's kind of stuck out to me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I was just going to repeat what Joey said. There was that one divergent there, but if you talk to families and you ask them what do they think was more important, they would say, I wanted to be included and part of the development of the IEP. When you talk to students, not one student shared, I wish my parent was more involved in the IEP, right. Not one. So I thought that was an interesting finding. It didn't emerge in our data there or the chart, but
yeah. Right. Well, I'm curious if just taking, you all look at you have different lenses, right? I know, Stacy, you're coming from the knowledge development from the Progress Center, and Joey coming from NCLD. And I'm curious if there were some survey findings that really sort of stuck out to you that were either surprising or alarming or validating. So, and Joey, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say I was struck by, and I shouldn't be surprised, but I know that parents are on the front lines fighting for their kids every day. But I think I was very surprised how quickly many of those focus groups really focus on all the negative aspects of school. And I understand, it's your lived experience. It's what you're grappling with every day, fighting for your rights. And there are schools that are doing really great things and schools that are really struggling to provide the resources and support and accommodations that students need. But I thought just generally that the students were critical, but also much more positive. They had positive, healthy relationships with school-based adults who were focused on them. They wanted things to be a little more individualized and really tailored to what their hopes and dreams and interests were. But I think that was one thing that really stood out to me. We heard many of the parent focus groups went way past time. They were very chatty, very interested in sharing their experiences. And many of them had very important revelatory experiences that I think we tried to put into this research brief. So yeah, I think those were things that stuck out for me. I don't know, Stacy, if anything else stuck out for you.
Yeah, I'm just one other thing that stuck out is for the findings with the students. If you just were to ask them what made you successful, most of them said just my teacher. I mean, how do you quantify that in an IEP? And others just said a small group and extended time. They said that's all they needed to feel successful. That was more at the secondary level, but I thought that was interesting.
So there was a question, you had shared a quote, and Joey, I think it was in your section around, the student made a comment around there's high and low expectations at different times. And I'm wondering if you can expand on what was meant by that, in the context, what were they really referring to?
Yeah, I think students are very perceptive of what we as adults expect of them, right? And we heard from many young adults that they had high expectations from teachers and their schools about how they would perform. And those were often explicit and laid out, whether those be in the IEP or in the informal conversations that teachers have with students. And then some also spoke to the unspoken or implicit expectations of students, like things that you may not be able to accomplish, so they're just not provided, or you're not asked of those to do those things. And students pick up on those. They pick up on them very astutely. And also, like, this population of students are, in general, this generation has a higher incidence of adverse childhood experiences, higher rates of anxiety, depression, and mental health needs. So their experiences in school with stigma and the expectations that are set for them, there's a little more intensity there, I think, and they understand that there's a lot of pressure on them to perform well, and also not be perceived as different, not be pulled out of classrooms for, you know, specialized instruction. And so they touched on that in quite a lot of the discussion, whether that be those explicit expectations or the implicit ones. So, you know, I work with young adults all the time, and, you know, they share with us similar anecdotes and experiences. So I wasn't completely shocked by this, but I think it is important to understand that, like, students are observing everything every day in school, and they know when something is being expected of them, or when they feel like they're going to let their teachers down or school folks down. They understand that context.
Thanks for sharing that. We have a question. This is more probably to you, Stacy. It's more of the logistical piece, but, you know, didn't look like all the states were represented. So if you can just kind of share again why, you know, those states were represented in the group, and then just curious about the sizes of school districts that participate, like where those folks were coming from. Were they primarily from large districts or small districts? And then one last piece of that, which is when you said young adults, what was that age group for young adults?
Okay, 3 questions there. Well, one, we did not collect data on the size of the districts, so I do not have that data for you. The majority of our recruitment was in the Northeast and East Coast, because that's where SPAN is located, and as they were just kind of working their sphere of influence, a lot of their networks were in that area. And Joey, you can pipe in. So that's districts, why recruitment is 16 states. What was the third?
And then what did you had mentioned they were young adults. So what was that, just a 7th grade, or what was that?
It was actually 18 to 24. We had a couple of students who were 18-year-olds in high school still. So most of them were post high school, post that transition process.
And that had a lot to do with consent and.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and I think you had mentioned that, you know, just for one, accessing, and I think that has come up, is just how do we access folks for these conversations? It's just really tricky, but also including students, as you mentioned, it was really hard to recruit the same number of students. And I'm curious, any thoughts about, you know, for those who are looking to do this type of work, maybe in their state or their district, any recommendations for how to better recruit students for these types of conversations?
I could talk all day about this. We have done quite a lot of focus groups, and also a lot of our programming with young adults relies on recruiting young adults who identify as having a disability. I'd say the most effective recruiters are young adults themselves. So, like, they rely on their personal networks, and that source of trust has to be a lot closer than just getting like a social media ad or prompt of some sort. I would say if you're thinking of engaging young adults or students, maybe in the high school range, really thinking about their networks and how to connect them together to find participants. That then does call into question, like, how wide can you get if you're relying on individual student networks? But I think it's important to know that, like, young adults, the perception of trust and engaging in something like a discussion like this, where you're talking actively about your disability, your experiences in school, there's a bit of vulnerability with that. And so relying on close, trusted peers, I think, is an effective strategy. It's probably one of the reasons why we struggled the most with these with recruiting young adults, because we had gotten a pretty wide reach of young adults. Many of them filled out the survey, but getting them to actually participate, it was a harder, because they wanted to know, was a friend going to participate or who would be involved. And so there's I think a lot to like consider as you're thinking about engaging young adults.
Yeah, and I would say that it's probably critical for us to really understand what's working and not working with our systems. I mean, parents are also a valuable resource to understand that. But as you mentioned, it's two different perspectives, right? Like this feeling of inclusion, this feeling of benefit is going to be perceived differently, whether you're the recipient or a partner in the development of that program. So I want to, as we close up, I'm curious what were some of, like, what is your biggest takeaway? And I'll ask both of you from this experience, like, what do you see is the most critical thing that our participants and others who'll be listening to this really need to take away from it? And we'll start with you, Stacy.
I think the big piece is just communicating and collaboration. I think that's one piece you can't quantify regardless of the size of your district. Or, right now with the teacher shortage, some of our educators don't have the understanding or the how, but any teacher, regardless of first-year teacher or 30 years, can communicate and open those lines of communication.
And Joey?
I would say young adults really want inclusion, and I think that's a broad term. They don't want to just be sitting in the room when their IEP is created. They want to make sure that it is aligned to their desires and what they want to do after school and what they think are their strengths, right? There's a lot of work out there about strengths-based IEPs. I would imagine that there is probably a big difference between what an educator might think of a student's strengths and they think of as their strengths. That could be a whole nother stream of research, actually. But building on like their perceptions of themselves in schools is really important, both because it empowers them, but also it helps them learn self-advocacy skills, which are essential after school, during school, to be, how do I say, we have a very ableist society, right? Students with disabilities unfortunately have to be their biggest self-advocates, because parents can't be there when they're in college. They can't be there when they're, going into their first jobs. They need to be able to develop those skills. And that's what they're asking for. They're asking for the opportunity to be included, to be listened to, and to have our systems be responsive to what they need.
Thank you. So just one last logistical question, Stacy. Are there any plans to, do a focus groups with educators?
Yes, funny you asked. I'm hosting one tonight. So we are recruiting educators. So if you are on right now, please scan the QR code. We have about 50 educators signed up right now. Our goal is 100. I will be hosting educator focus groups through May. So if there is a time when you do the scan the QR code that's not available, go ahead and sign up and I will follow up with you via email. So these educator focus groups are just roughly over an hour. We will get you in on time and started and out on time, but really we want to hear about what's going well, what's not, what are the successes that you're experiencing in your district, what are the challenges. We are specifically looking for gen ed, special ed, related service providers, and administrators. So if you just have an hour over the next 6 weeks and can pipe in, we will reward you with $50. You don't have to spend it on your classroom. You can take yourself to dinner. So please sign up. We would love to hear from you.
Thanks, Stacy. Well, we're going to close up our session today, and I just want to share a couple of resources. And as you heard from Joey today, the National Center for Learning Disabilities is a great resource. It's a lot of advocacy work, helping students really understand, as Joey mentioned, sort of what they can do to self-advocate and how parents and educators can support that. We had mentioned the IEP tip sheets, and I just want to share that there are supplementary self-paced modules that go along with that. Joey mentioned a couple around the learning about special education law. These are designed to help you just understand the basics. So whether you're an educator, a service provider, working at the state or the local level, you really have a good basic understanding of what are the requirements under IDEA, both from the development of the IEP, but as well as the implementation piece, right? What are the requirements for the overall act itself? And the IEP tip sheets I mentioned, if you look on the website, which is www.promotingprogress.org, you will see that there are a number of tip sheets to really help with the development of the IEP. These are great resources to also share with families so that we can all be on the same page around the individual components as well as the IEP as a single document. And then I highly recommend connecting and being aware of your parent hub. Even if you are an educator, they're great partners in helping ensure that there are information and tools that you can share with your parents and vice versa, right? We are in this together. There's no way the school can do this on their own, and there's no way that parents can as well. And we want to make sure that we're all collectively being advocates for the students that we're working with. And you can see in the chat box, Amy put the link to the parent centers. I also want to encourage you to stay connected with us. We have a very active Facebook and Twitter. You can follow us at K-12 Progress. I also want to recommend signing up for the newsletter so you'll find out anything that's new. So the results, like Stacy mentioned with their educator focus groups, new resources, new modules, those will all be outlined in that newsletter. That doesn't come too frequently, but just frequently enough for you to stay on top of things. I want to thank you again for your participation in today's webinar and the great questions that you submitted, and we look forward to hearing from you on future webinars. Be sure to take a moment to conduct or finalize our survey or access our survey. You can see that in the lower right-hand corner, and it shouldn't take very long. And if you have any feedback about future webinars, we would appreciate it. Have a great evening and enjoy your upcoming weekend.